Hi everyone, this is Blake Anderson, a registered social worker and therapist here in Toronto, Ontario. I have over 14 years of experience as a social worker and 5 years as a therapist. In this video, I want to highlight some core practices and some of the outlining of the book by Dr. Salerno in his book, Traumatic Cognitive Dissidence. And in that book, he has many recommendations as well as clarifying certain myths in terms of debunking certain myths in regards to the post-traumatic journey or when you are been on the receiving end of narcissistic abuse. He, I think, focuses primarily, well, on any relationship, but I think it's tailored, at least when he speaks, more to do with the romantic situation. But certainly in that book, he talks about certain myths that he debunks and also aspects of recovery when thinking about this journey. I found his book, it's not like I always agree on 100% of what he says, but it's a helpful book for those on the recovery journey. So in this video, I'm going to cover aspects of that book and walk you through some of the core aspects of it and certain recommendations he has. Dr. Peter Salerno, in his book, Traumatic Cognitive Dissidence, talks about aspects of being on the receiving end of disorganized personality, particularly with narcissism, but understand any disorganized personality. In that book, he talks about his own journey, and I guess in his own personal life was also subject to this. And I understand he was a psychologist studying in university and I believe a psychologist, but still went through this challenge of being on the receiving end of this dynamic. He speaks from his personal experience as well as his clinical practice. What's helpful too is that he talks about the evolutionary aspect or the biological element, believing that it's to do with the biological origins of the person. I believe he's open-minded to the idea that there's certain nurture versus nature, but I believe he leans more heavily on the aspect that it's most likely a biological element, if not solely. I've watched a recent interview with him, and he does suggest that it could definitely be environmental, but I believe he doesn't want us, I guess he's just suspicious of this notion that all personality disorders are a product of trauma. And he believes that's sometimes a failed errand as it gives too much credence to the fact that these individuals are somehow victims. I think he talks about them being more of a predator and having intentionality. But then again, it depends on the personality disorder. When I spoke to Sam Vakkanen and did an interview, he mentions that it's a failed AI. In some sense, they're not aware of the architect. If you take a matrix reference, in terms of the creator of their personality, they're aware of what they're doing, but they're not aware of the code, if that makes sense. But then there's not intentionality in the way a psychopath would, just in the sense that the narcissist is embedded within the shared fantasy and they don't have proper reality testing, so they're semi-psychotic. That's to go into Sam Vakkanen. Dr. Peter Salerno is a psychologist in California, and in this book called Traumatic Cognitive Dissidence, he mentions core beliefs as one of the key aspects in terms of recovery on this journey. He talks in that book about what it's like to be on the receiving end of this disorganized personality that particularly has a predatory nature and how this can create a gaslighting experience as well as erosion of the self and the way in which it shows up in terms of complex trauma within the individual. So in his book, he recommends challenging or getting back to your core beliefs, challenging some of the myths, and then he talks about certain practices to get back to yourself in terms of your body and your mind, as well as staying committed to your own integrity. He talks about the 8 healthy beliefs he highlights for rebuilding. He has courage, facing fears head on without crumbling, humor, lightening the load, laughing at the absurdity, owning your true self, no masks, resilience, bouncing back stronger each time, compassion, kindness toward yourself, curiosity, questioning narratives with an open mind, connection, building real safe bonds, empowerment, taking back your power step by step. These are 8 core beliefs that he says are not present within the disorganized personality. He also questions some of the myths around boundaries. He says that typically they don't respect boundaries or they don't see boundaries if you take a narcissist, as again, there's a lack of reality testing, and 2, they usually don't care, or they look for the drama, right? So they're going to push back your past your boundaries regardless. At the end of the day, a limited contact or going no contact is the essential boundary. He talks about how that's somewhat of a myth in terms of something that you should necessarily completely focus on. He also talks about how having anger is not something you should avoid, that he talks about the notion of righteous rage. So this is having that genuine feeling of anger towards that person. And that's something that you should express, at least in terms of certain practices, or channel it into certain ways to your life. And just a sense of forgiveness so that you don't have to forgive the narcissist. The notion of empathy. He talks about the empath and how sometimes people analyze being less empathetic, but there's usually more going on than just that. He talks about the notion of anxiety and a certain hypervigilance when you're in the trauma bond, and that's a more important examination to look at. And it's not about a lack of empathy, he says, or too much empathy. He also talks about how codependency has been a word overused in this literature, in this context, he believes, largely, just in the sense that that comes from the literature in terms of alcoholics. Typical caregivers of an alcoholic, because of the dependency of the addict, had to depend on the alcoholic and had to be a codependent in that regard. So that's been applied to people who have been on the receiving of narcissistic abuse. And obviously there's aspects in which if someone's in that relationship for many years, you could say that there's a certain codependency. But he talks about in this book that it's somewhat the wrong lens to look at, as he talks about it's not necessarily that you're insecure or that's anything particular. He says there's a lot of resilience in the self. You won't necessarily want to apply that label, I guess is what he's saying, particularly if you're getting out of that dynamic, because it's not really an empowering term, but you can understand how you had a codependency in the relationship. And he just has a few other myths that he debunks in that book. The main one is just in terms of the therapist. And so he talks about how a lot of therapists are orientated towards a more humanist model and don't have insights and understandings fully, at least some, in terms of a personality disorder and this disorganized personality and the real traumatic impacts it can have and relationship trauma that can occur within these dynamics. He just talks about how it's not really about improving communication, particularly you being better at your communication, because for these individuals, he talks about them being like a predator and they're intentional with regards to the way that they seek harm and cause harm in the person on the receiving end. And so he says it's not about you being a more effective communicator, but you go to a therapist and if they don't understand the destructive nature of these personality disorders, and they apply more of a lens of communication or seeing aspects in the narcissist or the disorganized personality in terms of some positives, but also maybe normalize saying that it takes two to tango in the sense that both are on a spectrum, or that people are likely the same, so that all people have good aspects and bad aspects. His point in that book is to talk about how that's really to miss the point, that personality disorders are a whole other category, and there's obviously a disease and disorder within a relationship, and these are relationship-based personality disorders. Because of their personality, it affects the relationships and the nearest and dearest around them. And so he just talks about how some clinicians or therapists, because they're applying more of a humanist lens or a normalizing sense that we're all alike, miss the point in terms of how the psyche is disordered and how this has real complex trauma impacts on the survivor or on the target. And so I think that's a good point to make, because it's important to understand personality disorders in this regard. I do have people reach out to me, or just, I think the popularity, at least this channel growing a bit, I think has to do with that more people are seeking this kind of information out. One that does understand the personality disorder, because certainly, what to say, just understand that not all therapists have that insight or that lens. And in that book, so he talks about core beliefs and those 8 good beliefs about the self. And so that's to also think about IFS therapy, internal family systems, and interjects. So he talks about when you're in the trauma bond, through the gaslighting and that experience, a lot of those core beliefs have probably been challenged, and that you've replaced some of those core beliefs being in the mind of the narcissist or the disorganized personality. And within that fractured self, it's also regressed you. A lot of these core beliefs have been challenged through that self-doubt or gaslighting and your own gaslighting and these notion of these interjects. So just, I guess, ruminating and getting obsessive about what your ex or what the narcissist is thinking is actually detrimental. He believes that the field or the literature in this area perhaps complicate things too much. And he also is against necessarily overly analyzing the past in terms of childhood, like early childhood experience. He says that's something that can come later. But if you're particularly still within the trauma bond, and he mentions how even if you go no contact, that doesn't mean you're out of the trauma bond or fully recovered. I certainly can speak to that situation and understand that there's a notion, right, of prolonged grief. And I would say that physical distance doesn't necessarily mean you're in one with, if it's your family, that your family's out of you in some sense. And again, this goes back to this notion of negative interjects. So there's these parts in yourself that are still believing these distortions. And you can understand that's not core to your genuine self. That's why I think it's important, and I like his book in the sense that it highlights more positive aspects of yourself. And he mentions humor, confidence, resiliency, and these sort of things. This also goes back to internal family systems, just in the sense of the 8 C's. So just understand the self in that regard. But again, when Sam Vatkin says if there's a negative interject, such as a father's voice or a mother's voice, you can take that as Carl Jung, that there's these archetypes, or the unhealthy mother and unhealthy father. So I understand that the self is genuinely positive and you're a healthier individual. But because you've regressed within the situation with the narcissist and these core beliefs have been challenged, and you probably, got convinced to some degree of the narcissist's distorted view of reality and of themselves and of you, and then you've come to internalize that. But if you can examine these core beliefs and challenge these interjects, these negative voices, and at least within a scapegoating context, you can understand this inner critic. That could be like your inner mother or negative interject of your mother and a father, or maybe a brother or sister. But it is, I think, just one, paying attention to it. So that's take kind of cognitive behavior therapy. So, first understanding why you're triggered, and then what's the thoughts and feelings, and also what's the behavior as a result of that. Then you can do your best to re-examine that trigger and what was your original beliefs and thoughts and feelings, and then do your best to reframe them and see them in a more positive light. And that goes back to this book in terms of some of the suggestions he has. And that goes back to some of the suggestions he has in this book. It speaks positively about EMDR. So that's an approach which does, it's a body-mind approach to address complex trauma. And so he recommends that as an approach that he finds helpful. And he goes into a few other ones, just rapid eye movement, and there is different ways that he approaches this in terms of recovery. Particularly when you're in the trauma bonds, this is if you're still interacting with your ex or within a family context and there's been an incident and you find yourself dysregulated and overly obsessing or ruminating about the situation, then he would say that it's getting back to those core beliefs. And in that book, he does talk about certain practices. One is to list out all the things that cause harm to you in the relationship in terms of the relationship violations. I spoke about that in other videos, and that's to do an inventory of what were the relationship violations and harms that were caused in the relationship. I think it's important to list those in detail, or perhaps you can dictate them to yourself. That's a good way to have a list, just so you're aware if you're ever tempted to go back, then you understand at least what were some of the violations without that concreteness on paper and writing it down. Your mind sometimes will go to self-doubt and gaslighting, especially when interacting with the narcissist or the disorganized personality. And so he talks about that in that book, is to list those out and do an inventory of the relationship harms that were caused in this relationship. 2, he talks about, again, going back to those core beliefs. And in that, he has a pledge, like you pledge to yourself, like integrity of the self. So you make a statement to yourself about what you will and will not tolerate in a relationship, but particularly what you deserve in terms of yourself. This obviously can come down to self-respect. You won't let someone mentally, emotionally, or verbally abuse you. You won't allow someone to change your reality, say that you're being overly sensitive and gaslight you. Just some of these aspects in terms of your own integrity of the self. Because again, within this dynamic, it's perhaps some of yourself's been eroded. And again, why that occurs, you can go into, but Obviously, when you're on the receiving of disorganized personality, particularly within narcissism, they've made you into an interject, and then within that, they've regressed you. If you take the dual mothership model, you're also in the shared fantasy. According to Sam Vakin, you have to grieve that idealized image of yourself, but then also this inner child that involved, just getting over your ex in terms of a breakup, or like your heart was broken, but it's an extra layer in terms of being within the disorganized personality and be on the receiving end of that. It's made many distortions, particularly to your core self. But I think the book is good in the sense that it's a refreshing look on the real harm that these individuals can cause you. He believes that there's more intentionality behind the narcissist, or at least some of these disorganized personalities. I think that's an open question. Some definitely err on the sense that they know what they're doing. But again, someone like, Sam Vakin has his own controversy, but at least he says that it's not operating correctly and they're not really aware of the code. He has different metaphors and understandings of this, particularly because they lack reality testing. It's like a paranoid person that you can't convince them otherwise, so they actually believe their lies, distortions, and false self. Dr. Peter Salerno believes that they are more intentional, and that crosses over to psychopathic behavior. Regardless if they know what they're doing or not, his main point is getting out of that trauma bond, recentering yourself, and he talks about that being the body-mind. He says that meditation might not always be helpful, but sometimes it could just be physical exercise and getting back to these practices, like he mentions EMDR, and also getting a therapist that understands personality disorders and the harm it can cause. And then last aspect too is just talking about like healthy families. So if you were talking to a friend and listed 10 aspects of a healthy family or a healthy relationship, what would you list? Because sometimes it's hard for us to do that for ourselves, but if we're thinking about a friend, we're most likely to, be more authentic and caring. I would say that some of my clients have issues with what would be the notion of a lack of self-love or self-respect to some degree. And again, if you've been on the receiving end of these dynamics for many years and your self has been eroded in that, and you have been gaslit and you've been believed some of these distortions, or if not all of them, then you have certainly regressed in that process. Your self-beliefs, I think that's why it's important, and it's a good recommendation from Dr. Peter Salerno, to get back to those core beliefs. Sometimes it's hard because of the self that's been eroded. Sometimes people need more external support. And I think that's where a therapist can come, and someone keeping you accountable and giving you some insight and a space to feel safe and heard. And it also could be a friend, and maybe in community as well. Sometimes people need to externalize their support because internally they feel like at least they lack the resources. But that goes back to extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. In my own journey, I think it's good to set up systems. If you set up a community or pay a little bit of money for like a training, it tends to motivate you, right, to follow through. And I think so that's definitely true for everyone. And I know from my own journey that if I spend some money on a course, I'm most likely to follow through. And that is a certain, I think, cognitive bias we have, and it could be used to our advantage. You could consider setting up your environment. Some people believe that just through willpower they can heal, but it is important to understand that we all need support. Having extrinsic habits and setting up your systems as well as in your environment to motivate you is definitely a consideration. That might mean a therapist or friends that are supportive, and also maybe online communities you can participate in. So in this video, I covered Dr. Peter Salerno's book, Traumatic Cognitive Dissidence. I focused mostly on the solutions he offers in that book, particularly around if you're in the trauma bond with a narcissist, and just some of the myths that he has in terms of debunking them, and also just his recommendations in terms of his practices. I thought it was a refreshing book. I would encourage you to pick it up if it's a book that you think might be interesting. And so if you did like this video, please like and subscribe. Thanks and have a great day.